Welcome, brave souls, to Nightmare Narratives, your portal to the dark and unexplainable. Tonight, we journey into the wilderness, where the beauty of nature hides its most terrifying secrets. From a trail that leads to nowhere, to a canyon filled with haunting echoes, and an ancient force lurking deep in the wilderness. These are the stories that will send shivers down your spine. Before we begin, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and tap the notification bell so you never miss a story that keeps you up at night. Give this video a like if you love spine-chilling tales, and let us know in the comments which story shook you the most. Now, let's step into the shadows together, if you dare. The Echoing Canyon. The deserts of Utah were both beautiful and unforgiving. Towering red rock formations stood sentinel over sprawling canyons, their ancient walls carved by millennia of wind and water. Megan and her fiancé Daniel had chosen this remote landscape for their weekend adventure, eager to escape the chaos of city life. But as they stood on the edge of Echoing Canyon, staring into its yawning depths, Megan couldn't shake a feeling of unease. "It's just a canyon," Daniel said, sensing her hesitation. He adjusted the straps of his backpack and smiled reassuringly. "Come on, the trail loops back up to the ridge. We'll be back by sunset." Megan forced a smile and nodded. The trail descended sharply, winding along the canyon's edge before disappearing into its shadowy depths. The air grew cooler as they descended, the oppressive heat of the desert giving way to an eerie stillness. Their footsteps echoed faintly, bouncing off the canyon walls in strange, distorted patterns. "They say the echoes here can travel for miles," Daniel said, his voice breaking the silence. "Native tribes used to call this place the Canyon of Voices. Pretty cool, huh?" Megan nodded absently, her eyes scanning the towering walls around them. The echoes made her uneasy, as if the canyon were alive and listening. She shivered and quickened her pace, eager to finish the loop and leave the oppressive stillness behind. Halfway through the canyon, they reached a narrow passage where the walls pressed close, leaving only a sliver of sky visible above. Megan paused, her heart racing. The air felt heavy, charged with something she couldn't name. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel stopped and turned to her, frowning. "Hear what?" A faint sound echoed through the canyon, a low, mournful wail that sent chills down Megan's spine. It was distant, yet unmistakable, like the cry of something not entirely human. "It's probably just the wind," Daniel said, though his voice lacked confidence. "These canyons can play tricks on you. Come on, let's keep moving." But as they continued, the wailing grew louder, more distinct. Megan's unease turned to outright fear as she realized the sound was following them, echoing closer with every step. The narrow passage opened into a wider section of the canyon, where the walls were adorned with ancient petroglyphs. Strange symbols and figures danced across the rock, their meanings long lost to time. Daniel stopped to examine them, his curiosity outweighing his unease. "Look at this," he said, tracing a finger over the carvings. "These symbols, they're not like anything I've seen before." Megan barely glanced at them, her attention fixed on the growing sense of dread that seemed to seep from the very rocks. "We need to go," she said urgently. Before Daniel could respond, the wailing rose to a deafening crescendo, echoing all around them. Megan clapped her hands over her ears, but the sound seemed to burrow into her skull, drowning out her thoughts. The ground beneath them trembled, and a gust of icy wind rushed through the canyon, carrying with it a voice that whispered in a language neither of them understood. "Run!" Megan screamed, grabbing Daniel's arm and pulling him away from the petroglyphs. They sprinted down the trail, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The canyon seemed to close in around them, the walls twisting and warping as if alive. The trail narrowed again, and they stumbled into another passage, this one darker and more oppressive than before. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a cacophony of voices. Shadows danced along the walls, moving independently of the faint sunlight that filtered down. Daniel stumbled and fell, his ankle twisting painfully. "I can't," he gasped, clutching his leg. Megan dropped to her knees beside him, tears streaming down her face. "We have to keep going," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "Please, Daniel, get up." But before he could respond, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was tall and gaunt, its skin an ashen gray that seemed to absorb the light. Its eyes were empty voids, and its mouth opened in a grotesque grin that revealed rows of needle-like teeth. "Leave," the figure hissed, its voice a guttural echo that reverberated through the canyon. Megan froze, unable to move or speak. The figure reached out with a spindly hand, its fingers ending in sharp claws. Daniel screamed, and the sound snapped Megan out of her trance. She grabbed a rock and hurled it at the creature, her aim wild but desperate. The creature recoiled, its form flickering like a mirage. Taking advantage of the moment, Megan hauled Daniel to his feet, his weight almost too much to bear. They stumbled forward, the creature's guttural growls echoing behind them. The trail twisted and turned, and Megan's legs burned with the effort of carrying them both. Just when she thought they couldn't go any further, the canyon opened up, spilling them into the blinding light of the desert. They collapsed onto the rocky ground, gasping for air. The whispers and wailing ceased, and the oppressive weight lifted. Megan turned to look back at the canyon, but the entrance was gone. Where it had been was now a solid wall of rock, as if the canyon had never existed. They made their way back to their car in silence, their bodies bruised and their minds fractured. Neither of them spoke of what they'd seen, the memories too raw and horrifying to confront. Years later, Megan still dreamed of the canyon. In her nightmares, she would hear the wailing and see the shadowy figure, its empty eyes staring into her soul. She knew she'd never escape the echoing canyon, no matter how far she ran, and deep down, she feared that one day, the whispers would call her back. The Vanishing Trail. The Appalachian Mountains stretched endlessly before them, a tapestry of green and gold under the late afternoon sun. Emma and her brother Jake had been hiking for 3 days, aiming to complete a lesser-known loop trail that promised breathtaking views and an escape from the ordinary. But as the path twisted deeper into the wilderness, they realized why it was so rarely traveled. The trail markers had grown sparse, the carved blazes faded or covered by moss. They relied on a worn map and a GPS device, but even those seemed to fail them as the dense forest closed in. Emma frowned, tapping the GPS screen. "It's glitching again," she said, holding the device up for Jake to see. "It keeps jumping around like it doesn't know where we are." "Great," Jake muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. "Let's just keep moving. The trail's got to connect back eventually." They pressed on, the forest growing darker as the sun dipped lower. The towering trees seemed to lean closer together, their gnarled branches forming an oppressive canopy. The air grew colder, carrying an unnatural stillness. Even the birds had fallen silent. "We'll set up camp soon," Jake said, though his voice lacked conviction. Emma nodded, her unease growing with every step. The trail ahead narrowed, overgrown with ferns and brambles, and then it stopped. "What the hell?" Jake muttered, staring at the abrupt end of the path. Before them lay a thicket so dense it seemed impenetrable. "This doesn't make sense. The map shows the trail continuing straight through here." Emma's fingers tightened around the straps of her backpack. "Maybe we missed a turn?" she suggested, though doubt filled her voice. She turned to look back the way they'd come, but the trail behind them was unrecognizable. It was as if the forest had shifted, swallowing the path in a sea of green. Panic prickled at the edges of her mind. "Let's set up camp," she said quickly, her voice higher than she intended. "We can figure it out in the morning." Jake hesitated, but nodded. They found a small clearing nearby and pitched their tent, the process made more difficult by the encroaching darkness. Dinner was a silent affair, each of them lost in their own uneasy thoughts. The fire they built seemed to push back the cold and silence, but only barely. As Emma lay in the tent, sleep eluded her. The forest outside was unnervingly quiet, as if the entire world were holding its breath. Just as her eyelids began to droop, a sound pierced the stillness, a low, melodic whistle. Her eyes snapped open, and she turned toward Jake, who was already sitting up. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. He nodded, his face pale. The whistle came again, closer this time, weaving through the trees like a haunting tune. It wasn't the call of any bird they'd ever heard. It was deliberate, almost human. "Who's there?" Jake called out, his voice shaking. There was no response, only the whistle, now accompanied by the faint crunch of footsteps on leaves. Emma's heart pounded as she clutched the flashlight, its beam trembling as she swung it toward the sound. The light revealed nothing but trees and shadows. "Let's get out of here," she urged, her voice trembling. Jake nodded, and they scrambled out of the tent, packing only the essentials. The whistling continued, following them as they hurried back the way they thought they'd come. But the forest seemed endless, the trees all the same, their branches clawing at the sky. Hours passed, or perhaps only minutes. Time lost meaning as fear drove them forward. The whistling grew fainter, then stopped altogether, leaving an eerie silence that was almost worse. Just as Emma began to think they were safe, a figure emerged from the shadows ahead. It was a man, or at least it had been once. His skin was pallid and stretched taut over his bones, his eyes hollow pits that seemed to drink in the light. He smiled, a grotesque stretch of lips that revealed jagged, yellow teeth. In his hand, he held a wooden flute, its surface blackened and cracked. "You're lost," he said, his voice raspy yet strangely melodic. Emma's knees buckled, and she grabbed Jake's arm for support. The man took a step closer, his movements jerky and unnatural. "The forest doesn't like trespassers." "We didn't mean to," Jake stammered. "We're just trying to find our way back." The man's grin widened. "There is no way back, only forward." He raised the flute to his lips and began to play. The melody was otherworldly, a haunting tune that burrowed into their minds. Emma clapped her hands over her ears, but it did little to muffle the sound. The world shifted around them. The trees twisted and bent, their branches forming grotesque shapes. The ground beneath their feet seemed to ripple like water. Emma screamed, grabbing Jake's hand as they ran blindly through the nightmare landscape. When they finally stopped, gasping for breath, the forest was silent once more. The man was gone, and the trees stood still, but the oppressive atmosphere remained. Emma looked around, tears streaming down her face. "Where are we?" she whispered. Jake shook his head, his expression hollow. The map and GPS were useless, and every direction looked the same. Days turned into weeks as they wandered, their supplies dwindling. The whistling returned at night, always distant but never far enough. One by one, they began to lose pieces of themselves. Jake grew gaunt and hollow-eyed, his once confident demeanor eroded by despair. Emma's thoughts turned fragmented, her memories of the outside world fading like a dream. The forest consumed them, body and soul, until they were nothing more than whispers on the wind. Hikers who ventured too close to the area reported strange occurrences, unexplainable paths that vanished, disembodied whistles in the night, and fleeting glimpses of a man with hollow eyes and a haunting smile. The locals warned against straying from the main trails, speaking in hushed tones about the vanishing trail. No one who wandered too far ever returned, but on quiet nights, the forest would echo with the mournful notes of a flute, a reminder of those who had been claimed by its depths. Whispers in the wilderness. The sun dipped below the jagged peaks of the northern Rockies, casting long shadows across the dense, untamed forest. Laura tightened the straps of her backpack and glanced at her friend Ben, who was adjusting the map under the fading light. They had ventured into this remote wilderness for adventure, seeking solace in the untouched beauty far from the bustling world they knew. But as the shadows grew, an unsettling stillness settled over the forest. "We'll set up camp here," Ben announced, pointing to a clearing by a slow-moving creek. The air was thick with the earthy scent of pine and moss, and the only sounds were the gurgling water and the occasional chirp of a distant bird. Laura nodded, relieved to stop after hours of hiking. Her legs ached, and her nerves tingled from an unease she couldn't quite place. As they pitched the tent, a sudden rustling in the underbrush made them freeze. Laura's heart raced as she scanned the area, but nothing emerged. "Probably just a rabbit," Ben said with a chuckle, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt. They lit a small fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the towering trees around them. Over a meal of dehydrated stew, they laughed off the strange noises and talked about their plans for the next day. By the time the fire burned down to glowing embers, the forest was cloaked in darkness. The stars above were brilliant, their light barely piercing the thick canopy. Laura crawled into the tent, trying to shake off the lingering sense of being watched. Sleep came fitfully, with dreams of shadowy figures and distant whispers. She awoke to a sound that froze her blood, a low, guttural growl, impossibly close. Her breath caught in her throat as she reached out to shake Ben awake. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Ben nodded, his eyes wide in the dim glow of their flashlight. "Stay here," he murmured, grabbing the hatchet they'd brought for chopping firewood. Laura wanted to protest, but fear clamped her voice. She watched as Ben unzipped the tent and stepped into the inky blackness. The seconds stretched into an eternity. Then came the scream, high-pitched, raw, and utterly inhuman. It echoed through the trees, silencing even the chirping crickets. Laura bolted upright, clutching the flashlight as her mind raced. "Ben?" she called, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. There was no response. Summoning every ounce of courage, she stepped outside. The fire had long since died, and the forest was an oppressive wall of darkness. She swung the flashlight in frantic arcs, its beam cutting through the void. "Ben!" she shouted, louder this time. A sound to her left made her spin around. It was a wet, shuffling noise, like something being dragged. The beam of her flashlight landed on a smear of crimson on the forest floor. Her stomach churned as she followed the trail, her steps faltering with each agonizing inch. The trail led to the creek, where the water glistened darkly in the weak light. "Ben?" she whispered again, her voice breaking. A shape loomed ahead, slumped against a tree. Relief flooded her for a brief moment before she saw his face. His eyes were wide, staring into nothingness, his mouth frozen in a silent scream. Deep gashes crisscrossed his torso, and his left arm hung by a thread of sinew. Laura stumbled backward, a scream caught in her throat. The flashlight fell from her trembling hands, plunging her into darkness. Panic overtook her, and she ran blindly through the forest, branches clawing at her skin. The whispers started then, faint and insidious, threading through the trees like a sinister wind. Laura. She stopped dead in her tracks, her name carried on the breeze. Her chest heaved as she turned in circles, trying to pinpoint the source. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, an incomprehensible cacophony that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Leave me alone," she screamed, her voice breaking. But the forest offered no solace. She tripped over a root and fell hard, her palms scraping against the rough ground. As she scrambled to her feet, she felt it, a cold, clammy hand brushing against her ankle. She bolted again, tears streaming down her face. The whispers turned to laughter, cruel and mocking, echoing all around her. She didn't stop until she burst into another clearing, her chest burning from exertion. In the center stood a towering tree, its bark twisted and blackened as if by fire. Strange symbols were carved into its surface, glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. A figure stood beneath the tree, tall and gaunt, its face obscured by a hood. It raised a skeletal hand, beckoning her forward. Against her will, Laura felt her legs move, drawn to the figure like a moth to flame. Her mind screamed to stop, to turn and run, but her body betrayed her. As she neared, the figure lowered its hood, revealing a face that defied comprehension. It was a shifting mass of shadows and eyes, mouths opening and closing in silent screams. Laura's sanity fractured, and she fell to her knees, the world spinning around her. "You should not have come here," the figure intoned, its voice a chorus of anguish. "This place is not for the living." Laura's vision blurred, the forest dissolving into a sea of darkness. When she awoke, she was alone beneath the twisted tree, the symbols now dark and lifeless. The whispers were gone, replaced by an eerie silence that pressed against her ears. Ben was nowhere to be found, and the forest felt even more alien, as if it had shifted in her absence. Stumbling back to the campsite, she found it in disarray. The tent was slashed to ribbons, their supplies scattered and trampled. There was no sign of Ben, or the trail they had followed to get there. It was as if the forest had swallowed everything whole. Laura wandered for hours, days, perhaps even weeks. Time lost all meaning in the endless expanse of trees. The whispers returned, always just out of reach, driving her to the brink of madness. Her body grew weak, her mind fractured, until she could no longer tell reality from nightmare. When the search party found her months later, she was huddled beneath the blackened tree, muttering incoherently. Ben's body was never recovered, and Laura's memories of that night remained a jumbled mess of terror and shadows. The forest was declared off limits after more hikers went missing, their disappearances marked by the same eerie whispers. Locals spoke of a curse, a malevolent force that guarded its domain with ruthless precision. And though Laura eventually left the area, the whispers followed her, haunting her dreams, and reminding her of the one truth she could never escape. The wilderness does not forget, and it does not forgive. You've heard the whispers and walked the trails, but the wilderness still holds countless secrets. Which story left you looking over your shoulder? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. We'll be waiting with more tales to keep you awake at night. Until next time, stay safe in the shadows.